Welcome to This Explainer. We often think of the US government as this dusty, static relic locked behind a museum glass somewhere. But it's actually much more like a massive, active operating system. It's a living blueprint that's been engineered over centuries to balance two really competing forces: the power to act and the restraint to protect individual freedom. So, let's dive right into this. All right, here's our roadmap for today. We'll be moving through 6 key stages: forging a new nation, the 3 branches, federalism and balanced power, expanding rights and liberties, parties, groups, and elections, and finally, we'll wrap up with the power of participation. Let's get right into it. Think about this for a second. It's the core engineering problem of the whole system. How do you actually build a government powerful enough to act, but restrained enough to protect individual freedom? It's an incredibly delicate balancing act, and it's the exact question that drove the founders to design a framework based on popular sovereignty, the rule of law, and strict checks and balances. Okay, part 1, forging a new nation. Let's talk about going from colonial grievances to a totally new framework. Long before there was officially a nation, there were these deep-seated colonial habits of self-government. For decades, colonists had been choosing local officials, paying taxes through their own assemblies, that kind of thing. So that sudden pushback against new British taxes, it was basically inevitable. In 1776, boom, the Declaration of Independence hits the scene, establishing that governments get their power from the consent of the governed. But fast forward to the 1780s, and the first attempt at a unified government is failing miserably. The economy was tanking, and armed uprisings like Shays' Rebellion, where frustrated farmers were literally marching on courthouses, proved this first draft just couldn't maintain order. So, in 1787, they locked the doors in a sweltering Philadelphia room for a complete rewrite. And that brings us to the ultimate system upgrade. The first try, the Articles of Confederation, was just way too weak. It couldn't tax, couldn't regulate commerce, and required unanimous consent to change anything. It was a gridlock nightmare. Leaders like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton realized they desperately needed a stronger central machine to manage national credit and secure loyalty. So they built the 1787 Constitution, a national framework with independent authority over taxation, commerce, and defense. A total game changer. Moving into part 2, the 3 branches, where we divide up the power of this machinery. At the Constitutional Convention, the delegates knew a strong central government was incredibly dangerous if left unchecked, so they designed a brand new blueprint that divided power into distinct compartments to prevent tyranny. Take Article 1, for example. It features the Great Compromise, a House based on population to satisfy the large states, and a Senate with equal representation for the small states. Then you have Article 2, setting up a single executive, the president, to enforce those laws. And finally, Article 3, creating an independent judiciary with lifetime appointments to interpret the laws without political pressure. Now, we really have to acknowledge that this early blueprint had some severe moral and political contradictions built right into it. The 3/5 Compromise counted 3/5 of the enslaved population for the purposes of representation and taxation. The institution of slavery was a massive point of contention at the convention, and rather than resolving the profound contradiction it presented to a nation built on liberty, the framers compromised on it, just to keep the southern states in the Union. Part 3, federalism and balanced power. Time to look at the blueprint's safety mechanisms. So the power is divided horizontally across branches, right? But they also needed ingenious safety valves to ensure no single entity could ever gain total control. Enter federalism, sharing power vertically. The national government is the supreme law of the land under Article 6, but the 10th Amendment reserves powers back to the states. Over time, landmark cases like McClellan v. Maryland and Gibbons v. Ogden actually expanded the national government's implied powers. And later on, the 14th and 15th Amendments significantly increased federal oversight of state practices, which fundamentally reshaped this vertical balance. Let's actually look at these horizontal safety mechanisms in action. Take the veto override process. It's literally a step-by-step dance that perfectly demonstrates how the branches interlock to check one another's power. Congress acts, the president blocks it with a veto, and then Congress can overpower that block with a 2/3 majority. And this is just one tool. You also have Senate confirmations of presidential appointments and congressional impeachment to ensure absolutely nobody steps out of line. And then you have the courts. They hold their own ultimate check, judicial review. Established in the landmark case of Marbury v. Madison, this gives federal courts the authority to interpret the Constitution and completely invalidate laws or executive actions that conflict with it. This specific power makes the judiciary a massive agent of constitutional change. It leads directly to landmark decisions that continue to shape civil liberties and public policy to this day.
All right, part 4, expanding rights and liberties. Basically, how the framework was updated for everyone.
Because a truly living blueprint has to adapt. Over the centuries, the system was modified to protect individuals and expand inclusion. Tracing these critical historical upgrades, it really starts in 1791 with the Bill of Rights, which protected core mechanisms of public deliberation like free speech in the First Amendment and the right to bear arms in the Second. Originally, these only applied to the national government, but later the 14th Amendment extended many of these protections down to the states through a process called selective incorporation. And just look at the massive expansion of the electorate. We went from just white male property owners to African American men via the 15th Amendment to women in 1920 with the 19th Amendment, and later abolishing poll taxes and lowering the voting age to 18. But constitutional amendments just aren't always enough on their own. The mid-20th century's civil rights movement was absolutely essential in challenging legal segregation. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. invoked the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence to demand equality. Through mass demonstrations, sit-ins, and freedom rides, they forced the system to respond. This led to monumental legislation like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to dismantle segregation and actively protect minority voting rights.
Part 5, parties, groups, and elections. Let's get into the operational dynamics of democracy.
So we've mapped out the structural blueprint. Now, what about the day-to-day mechanisms, the engine that actually drives this thing? Right from the beginning, disagreements over national authority created the first political parties. You had the Federalists, led by Hamilton and Adams, pushing for a strong national government and commercial development. On the other side, the Democratic Republicans, led by Jefferson and Madison, pushing for states' rights and agrarian interests. The crazy part? The election of 1800 saw power transfer peacefully from one of these factions to the other. That peaceful transfer without violence was a massive stress test for the new blueprint, and it passed. Of course, this party system naturally evolved alongside the country. We saw the Jacksonian era introduce mass-based political campaigns, and in the complete fracturing of major parties over the issue of slavery, leading to the rise of the Republican Party under Abraham Lincoln. The Civil War and Reconstruction that followed fundamentally redefined the terms of the national union and citizenship. All of this intense history shaped the deeply entrenched, highly resource-intensive, and media-driven electoral campaigns that we are all so familiar with today. Flash forward to today, and three main forces act as our primary interface with the government. First, political parties. They organize the candidates and get voters to the polls. Second, interest groups, representing everyone from massive businesses to labor unions and civil rights organizations, constantly seeking to influence congressional legislation and executive action. And third, the electoral system itself, which is heavily regulated by laws, constitutional provisions, and of course, the Electoral College. This is exactly how public preference translates into governmental action. And that brings us to our final section, Part 6, the power of participation. You are the operator. Because here is the undeniable truth about everything we've just talked about. This massive, intricate machine, it relies entirely on the people to actually function. The American political system fundamentally assumes that citizens have both rights and responsibilities. And participation isn't just one thing. Yes, it's voting in local and national elections, for sure. But it's also joining advocacy groups, attending public meetings, contacting your elected officials, and engaging in informed public discourse. Even with all the rapid technological shifts in how we consume media today, a functioning democracy absolutely requires an engaged citizenry that is willing to deliberate, cooperate, and hold leaders accountable, all while respecting the rule of law. Which leaves us with one final thought for this explainer. The blueprint is built. The safety valves are in place. The system has evolved over centuries to include more voices and protect more liberties than ever before. But it is not a finished product. It's a dynamic, living framework. So the ultimate question is, how will you participate in shaping this ongoing experiment?